Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ari Bernstein. I'm the interim director of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health Center for Climate Health and the Global Environment and a pediatrician at Boston Children's Hospital. I want to be the first to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation about how we can move climate action forward. The event is co-sponsored by the members of the Harvard College Class of 1969, Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment, Harvard Club of New Hampshire, the Harvard Office for Sustainability, and the Harvard Alumni Association. The conversation has clearly struck a chord in the Harvard alumni community. About 1,900 people have registered with graduation dates going back to the 60s and up to the present day. As an alum of the Chan School and having worked on climate, health, and equity for 2 decades, I couldn't be more pleased for all of us to be together to have this conversation today. I used to get asked a lot as a pediatrician why I was spending so much time thinking about climate change. I'm happy to report I don't get asked that so much anymore. You see, my job as a pediatrician is to keep children healthy, help ensure that they stay in good health so that they can lead happy, healthy, productive, and purposeful lives. And it was as clear to me 20 years ago that I couldn't do my job with climate change as it is today. While more people understand that climate is a health issue, and so I don't get asked so many questions anymore, we now understand that health may be the single most important issue when it comes to advancing climate actions, and that healthcare providers may be the most and best messengers. Moving forward on climate change is not a scientific problem. It's a political one. And it's a political one because powerful individuals and companies have made it so. What science has told us is that to depoliticize climate change, to make it personal and actionable and urgent, we have to talk about health and equity. At the same time, we now can see that climate actions, lesser burning of fossil fuels, lesser chopping down of forests, less time sitting in cars and traffic jams, less consumption of red meat among them, are precisely the actions that we need to take to address the major health and health equity problems we face. If I had a prescription pad and could write those things down, we would be far better off. We spend nearly $4 trillion every year in the United States on sick care. A lion's share of that is preventable. Diseases like obesity that were rarefied when I started training as a doctor are now commonplace and sourcing huge burdens of ill health. From heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, mental health disorders, even cancer. To address obesity, we have to address climate change. Turns out to prevent the next pandemic, the next COVID-19, we have to address climate change. Deforestation, which contributes about 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally every year, is also a primary driver of disease emergence like COVID-19. Climate actions are also anti-racist actions. We know that air pollution is not an equal opportunity killer. Black Americans, as an example, breathe far more polluted Americans than others. And we now have evidence that suggests that the ridiculously disproportionate death toll in the Black American community may in fact be a reflection of the air pollution that they have been forced to breathe. At Harvard, I can see a groundswell in interest around climate, health, and equity today. There's no question that current Harvard students and alumni in particular have been a predominant force in pushing us forward to do more. But the truth is, it is still radically inadequate to the challenge and what we could do. The panel we have here today will surely give us all food for thought on how we can work together and provide for a healthier, more just, and sustainable world. Now I'm pleased to turn over the floor to Steve Curwood, who will moderate today's conversation. Steve is the host and executive producer of the weekly program Living on Earth, which he is enormously distinguished in having done so. And Steve, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ari, for that generous introduction. And just for a moment, I'd like to tip my hat to Philip Lovejoy from the Harvard Alumni Association. Phil, are you plugged into the session here? If you have a moment to say a couple of words. I'm not, oh, I'm sorry. I'm not seeing him there. Oh, okay. So this will be later on. But just again, I want to echo the thanks that Ari gave to, of course, I'm biased. I'm a member of the class of 1969, but HAA, the Harvard Climate Group, in bringing these talks together, because this is indeed as serious as it gets. Just think about today. As we're sitting in this session, the House of Representatives is debating yet another impeachment resolution for the President of the United States after the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. The count in the pandemic, both the number of people who got the disease, the number of people who are in hospitals, the death toll, all of that is not in good shape right now, to put it mildly. And yet, behind this is the climate emergency, which, if we don't deal with appropriately, will make those other two issues far less important. The climate emergency is an existential threat to our civilization, not just our way of life, but just, our ability to function as human beings the way that we've been functioning over these many millennia, certainly since the rise of civilization. So this is really an important discussion today, and I'm so glad that you've decided to join us. So let me just briefly mention our cast. We have Ilana Cohen. She's a student at Harvard. If I could see your picture for a moment, Ilana, give a wave. Yeah, here she is. And so, surprisingly, a very effective climate activist. Also joining us is Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, another Harvard alum who happens to be Ilana, where is your pitch? Where is your video? I'm seeing you. Oh, there you are. Okay. A marine biologist, and also you'll find her on the podcast, How to Save the Planet. Great communicator, terrific book that she has, All We Can Save. I would highly recommend that anybody interested in this take a look. And we have Jeremy Grantham from Grantham Management, but also from the foundation, which, by the way, has supported a lot of this work, and including Living on Earth. And Bill McKibben, who is as a Harvard alum and as a former alum teacher. In fact, I believe you, Ayanna, and Bill had a ESPP seminar together many years ago.
Yeah, I think it was like the year 2000. Bill and James McCarthy, Professor McCarthy.
And Jim McCarthy, yeah. So no influence there, Bill. Obviously, Ayanna picked another course for her career, huh?
I was like, this is terrible. Get me out of this climate stuff forever.
Well, the answer is to get out of this climate thing, we have to do it together. So quickly, let me ask each of you, what got you into this concern and then taking action on climate? Let me start with you, Ilana. Can you hear me?
Well, okay. I'm from New York, as you'll probably be able to tell. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, there's a bit of latency, but keep going.
Yeah, so I'm from New York, as you may be able to tell, unfortunately, at some points during the panel due to the noises of Brooklyn outside my window. But when I turned 12, or a few weeks after, I should say, Hurricane Sandy hit, and I had my first conscious experience with climate disaster. But the thing that most resonated with me from it was not necessarily any of the physical damage that resulted from Sandy in the city, though there was a lot, or even the loss of life, because at that age, it just wasn't something I could fully comprehend. But seeing pictures of students who were my age in other boroughs, other parts of the city that were less affluent, harder hit, who were unable to go to school for at least weeks after the storm. Whereas I was able to return within a day of Sandy ending. And that was sort of the moment for me that catalyzed a deeper understanding of how structural and inequalities and injustices that play along racial and economic lines, as well as gender lines, are fundamentally intertwined with the climate crisis. And the more I came to reflect on that experience as I learned about climate change and environmental politics in high school, and eventually got involved with Zero Hour, which is an international youth group for climate justice, it became clear to me that there was no way actually to sort of further the kind of more equitable and just future that I wanted without dealing with climate change. These issues are really inseparable. And that's really what inspired me to first get involved with the divestment movement, where I'm now a happy organizer at Harvard, and ultimately to utilize writing really as a platform for humanizing the climate crisis and getting out the stories that I think mobilize people to action. Because at the end of the day, I think there are a lot of facts and figures that are truly, truly terrifying, but nothing compels people to act more than compassion and empathy and a basic understanding of why the climate crisis is a human crisis that impacts everyone, and it impacts you and it impacts your neighbors. And the more people understand that, the more people I think we're going to have on our side rallying for action.
Right on there. How about you, Ilana? Elizabeth, what got you into this?
I mean, there are so many potential inflection points, right, in deciding what we want to be when we grow up. And my first professional love was the ocean. I decided I was going to become a marine biologist when I was 5, but then, you know, when I was 10 and I learned about the civil rights movement, my next dream job was to be the lawyer that got the next Martin Luther King out of jail. Super specific dream job. And then, you know, when I started backpacking and hiking in the Rockies, I wanted to be a park ranger, because like, what could be better than getting paid to walk around in the woods? And when I was at Harvard, I thought, you know, maybe I can be an environmental lawyer. I took environmental law at the law school. I took, environmental economics at the Kennedy School. I took this seminar with Bill McKibben on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and their forthcoming third assessment report at the time. And I had this moment while I was studying abroad in Turks and Caicos in the Caribbean, I was back to marine biology and like, is this what I'm going to be? And I realized that they're all connected, right? If you want to do ocean conservation, it's science, it's policy, it's community and justice work, it's protection, it's legal. And so that's kind of where my work has been centered. And as the climate crisis gets more dire, as I started to learn more about the ways in which the ocean was affected by it, is a driver of the climate system and also the source of so many potential climate solutions that we ignore. That's when I think my work became focused more on climate, when I realized I actually had expertise, having gone on to do a PhD in marine biology and ocean policy, that I could be a part of the climate work too. And I feel like I've spent the last 2 years raising my hand and saying, like, don't forget about the ocean when you're doing climate stuff. So, co-creating the Blue New Deal and all these other policy initiatives for offshore wind and regenerative farming of the ocean and protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems that absorb many times more carbon than a forest on land per acre. So just trying to bring more of these issues into the discourse. And it feels like a useful way to try to contribute.
Well, thank you for that. Jeremy Grantham, let me ask you how you got into this. You've had an amazing career. Of course, in financial management and leading endowments and people with large holdings, helping them. You founded an and supported a number of institutions. I'm thinking right now of the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics, where you can find all kinds of folks who will tell you what the climate emergency is doing and will do in the world of finance. But that doesn't tell me what got you into this. What did?
Been asked this a few times, so finally I've put together my official story. The first 20 years in America, we spent all our vacations staying in touch with our families in Europe. And we realized that we were going to miss out on some adventures. So 30 years ago, in a 3-year window, we went to the Amazon and then Africa and then Borneo. And we, as a family of 5, we never recovered from the shock. It was pretty clear that the environment was having a bad time and that we better concentrate whatever philanthropy we had in that area. And a few years later, 23 years ago, we started a foundation for the protection of the environment. And within about 3 years, we had focused on climate change as the driving force, without which everything else would be wasted. You could protect all the land you wanted to, but if you didn't look after climate change, it would all come to nothing in the end. So climate change, I think, is the dominant theme in the environment. The more we got into it, the more drastic it seemed, the more obvious it was that we were losing the race. And we quickly came to frame it as the race of our lives between, on the one hand, magnificent technologies, always outperforming our expectations, really. And on the other hand, idiot human behavior and the defense of vested interest, making sure that we ignored most of the progress that we technically had available. And as it seemed to us to get worse, so our commitment increased. And by 10 years ago, we basically committed, let us say, well over 90% of our family net worth to the foundation and the public trust. And within that, we have decided that green investing is every bit as powerful as making grants. And we have now 80% of all our capital tied up in venture capital, with a rising share of that in green technology. And we consider that venture capital is indeed the best component of American capitalism. And we believe that the green subset is one of the better 2 or 3 subsets. So this is one of those rare cases where you can have your cake and eat it, where you can do the right thing and hopefully have it come back with profit and get repositioned, come back with even more profit and get repositioned out into the setting sun. So I think mission-driven green investing is a perfect way for a philanthropist to drive the cause forward.
Well, thank you. So Bill McKibben, how did you get into this? I think once upon a time you had a day job at the New Yorker. You wrote this book called The End of Nature.
Yeah, Steve. First of all, how good to see you. You and I have been carrying on this conversation in one form or another for many decades. And what a pleasure to be with the rest of this panel, who are people that I admire enormously and who are doing amazing work. And I am forced to confess that my beginnings in this work, I think, were somewhat less noble than everybody else's. Steve, when I was at Harvard, I was barely at Harvard. My attentions were all focused on 14 Plimpton Street and the Crimson. And, it's all I was a journalist. And so when I left, I went off to New York, as you said, and started writing the Talk of the Town column for the New Yorker and so on and so forth. And these were the years, when climate change was, if you were paying very close attention to the scientific literature, it was beginning, but it wasn't out in public yet. And I think as a good, young, ambitious journalist, part of me was just like, hey, this is going to be the biggest story of all time. And no one's writing about it, and maybe I should. And that's part of what got me going on writing The End of Nature, which became the first book about climate change. Now, halfway through the damn book, it became extraordinarily clear to me that, I wasn't any longer objective in the sense that I'd been trained as a newspaper man to be objective. That is to say, I cared very much about, I did not want the world to, heat up and get destroyed. And so that kind of changed the course of my life. I couldn't go off and be the beat reporter about climate change for the Times or something. And instead, I kept writing books and eventually decided that writing books was not moving the needle fast enough and that we needed to also build movements to challenge the incredible, overwhelming power of the fossil fuel industry. And so helped start with a bunch of young people, 350.org, which was kind of the first iteration of a global climate movement. And, now I end up, in jail needing people like what Dr. Johnson was going to be there to get me out, and so on and so forth. But as I say, my beginnings were as much out of curiosity as anything else.
Well, thanks, Bill. So let's get our discussion going. And one way we might start is to just have folks look ahead in the story of the climate emergency and look back maybe from a time in the future where we have solved this and tell us how we were able to do it. So what are because the people who are tuned into this, people, a lot of the questions that we got were, is it too late to do anything, and what's to be done? Of course, the is it too late question, one way you can answer that is, well, throw up your hands. But I don't think anybody here wants to throw up their hands. I think we're actively engaged in trying to do something. So let's look down the road, not a year or two, but maybe a decade or two, and look back and see what was done to make the change so that yes, of course, we're seeing the impacts of climate disruption right now. And no, even if we were to stop all emissions and start to get the level of CO2 back to 275, which is what it was, in 1800, we would still have things going wrong, but we would be on a trajectory, on a hopeful trajectory, and one that was avoiding the worst of the suffering. So how do you think we might have done that? Who would like to go first on this one?
I'll take a shot at that. Obviously, the answer is we need a lot of solutions and we need them quickly. And the good news is we have most of the solutions we need, right? Like we know how to use things other than fossil fuels. We know how to electrify the grid. We know how to electrify transportation for the most part. We know how to farm in a way that absorbs carbon instead of releases it regeneratively. We know how to protect and restore ecosystems. Like we know what to do. We know how to invest in the future we want instead of investing in the fast track to hell, right? Like we have all of these things that are happening. There's a question in part of momentum. There's a question, of course, of government leadership, of corporate leadership, of civic leadership, of a cultural transformation that holds all those other entities to a much higher bar. And because we're talking to Harvard alumni, of course, I can't help but mention that Harvard hasn't divested. Harvard is still sort of on the wrong side of history when it comes to where we're putting our endowment. And so there's a campaign right now to get Harvard alumni on the board of overseers who actually care and prioritize the climate crisis. So for the alumni who are listening who want to be a part of that, you can check that out at harvardforward.org/vote. Like, what is that all about? There's lots of details there that alumni have been leading this effort. But I think the thing that doesn't get talked about enough is nature itself. That ecosystems, protecting and restoring, not just forests, but grasslands and kelp forests and oyster reefs and wetlands and seagrasses. All of these are major climate solutions because the biodiversity crisis is intertwined with the climate crisis. These are the ecosystems that feed us, that purify our water and air. And I think we get sucked into this sort of technology, techno-utopian version of the future, as opposed to thinking like, what would it be like to actually heal ecosystems and our relationship with nature?
Indeed. Now, Jeremy, you have, in your work, you're very careful to set targets and use strategic thinking and execute and such. So what's the plan that you see would be bailing us out of the climate emergency if we look ahead a couple of decades?
And just let me, before I get there, make the point that divestment, not just a question of doing the right thing and preempting the position of leader that is begging to be taken by a great university, and none of them have stepped up. But the lack of divestment has been the biggest loss of potential value in the history of the stock market. The oil industry was 23% of the Standard & Poor's 500 in 1982. It was 16% 10 years ago, when the divestment movement was already afoot. And yesterday or today, it's 3%. It's less than 3%. There has never been such a big transfer of wealth, a missed opportunity. So not only were the ethics questionable, but the cost was painful. Now, I think we are not going to solve this problem out of goodness and enlightenment. That is necessary, but I suspect there's just not enough of it to get the job done. I think we're going to actually scrape by if we do, because of a combination of technology and obvious increasing pain. Increasing pain, the odd hurricane here, the giant fire there, actually concentrates the mind of the public and the politicians like nothing else. And behind the scenes, the technology is racing ahead to produce cheap, alternative, renewable energy and ways we can decarbonize the system. It is, in a way, too late. It's too late to prevent an enormous amount of pain. We've already had a lot of pain, and we will have a lot more because of inertia in the system. But it is, I hope, it is probably not too late to basically save our bacon, which is to say, to retain enough of the reasonably stable global civilization that we enjoy today.
So, Ilana, what do you see? I mean, in your work, you reflect the fact that equity seems to be getting better, that people are moving in a positive direction to bring us together. How does that relate to your vision of how we will solve this climate emergency?
Yeah, I think the youth-led climate movement, now admittedly I am a youth still, so maybe I'm somewhat biased there, but I mean, from what I've seen, the youth-led climate movement is genuinely, I think, the most promising sign of what's to come in terms of not just a rapid transition to clean energy, but a just and equitable one at base. I think that fundamentally young people, and particularly where the youth climate movement has gotten to now, which is really a testament to actually the work of the Black Lives Matter movement, and in many ways, the protests that unfolded this summer. I think the movement is at a much more intersectional place, and people have done the thinking that is necessary to look to the complement of divestment, right, which is just and sustainable reinvestment. I think it's really important to note that, in my mind at least, divestment is that two-part project, right? There's the necessary taking money out of industries that are fundamentally driving the climate crisis, fundamentally driving climate injustice, but there's also the need for a massive injection of funds into fundamentally different kinds of business models that are going to realize and scale up the world we want to inhabit, which is one that is fundamentally more equitable and more habitable for future generations. And I just want to pick up on something also that Ilana said earlier in the context of Harvard Forward, which is that I think sometimes it's easy to forget that the project of strengthening democracy and furthering climate justice go hand in hand. Mark Hertsgaard of The Nation actually had a really incredible piece that I think may have just come out earlier today about how, the attack on the Capitol we saw last week makes that connection really, really palpable. But ultimately, the vast majority of people want to have good paying green jobs. They want to have a future that works for their children. They want to have a future that works for their grandchildren. And they want their political leadership to be taking action that reflects those desires. So maybe people disagree on exactly what kinds of climate solutions they want to see, but overall, people agree that we need climate solutions and we need them now. And that we need some sort of systemic change to be wrapped up in that. And that's a promising sign, right? Because it means that we can strengthen our democracy and really have a fundamentally more democratic system, both at a large scale, right? Like in terms of our federal government, but also at a smaller scale at institutions like Harvard. And we can push for more just and sustainable investment at the same time. They're necessarily coupled, right? The reason that Harvard hasn't divested is not because the people at Harvard don't understand the incredible research that like Jeremy and Bill and Ilana and others are putting out there. It's because of inertia, and it's because of this ridiculous ongoing love affair with an industry that's hell-bent on destroying the planet and unwillingness to sever ties with that industry. And if we had a more transparent and democratic structure of governance at Harvard, that just wouldn't be the case. We would have divested long time ago. And that's why movements like Harvard Forward are important. And it's why scaling them up at every level is so critical.
Yeah, although Ilana, I have to just say that spending time as a member of an investment committee for another college that begins with H, Haverford, and speaking about divestment a number of years ago, that was a very transparent process that nonetheless heels were dug in and millions of dollars were lost as a function of staying with those investments. So I think we need more in the sauce. What's going to make this secret sauce?
Can I just add something onto there? I think I just wanted to agree with Ilana about the value of the youth climate movement. And Ilana, your remarks are the perfect example of this. I think what that movement has done is provide a much needed sense of moral clarity, right? The way that you talk about these corporations basically like screwing us over and how unnecessary it all is, like there actually is a right and a wrong here. And I think so as I've aged, you get so used to compromise, but that you can forget that. And the moral clarity that young people are bringing to this work is absolutely invaluable. And the connection with democracy, I mean, the joke in my circles right now has been like, what's the sort of Venn diagram between climate deniers and election deniers, right? It is approaching a circle in some sense. So when we think about the crisis of our democracy and what that means for the possibilities of passing robust federal climate policy, like what the filibuster means, what the people in office mean for whether we can get things done as a nation, or if we spend 4 more years sort of like holding back the worst and trying to get things done at a local level when things are intractable at a federal level. I think there's a really important moment here. A lot of people are distracted by what's happening in DC. I'm certainly not writing any climate policy documents in the last week, and it's not a distraction. Like whether or not we have a functioning democracy is critical to whether or not we have a coordinated federal approach on climate solutions. So I just wanted to emphasize how those dots are indeed so thoroughly connected.
Bill?
Well, and Steve, to try and sort of tie a few of these things together, because I think what Ilana is saying is absolutely right. And Ilana, Time magazine asked me to do exactly this exercise a couple of years ago, and I wrote a cover story about looking back from 2050. And the broad outlines of what needs to happen are not all that hard to figure out. They're what Jeremy and others have been alluding to. Right now, the engineers have done their job, and solar power and wind power are the cheapest way to generate electricity on this planet, and we can use electricity to do almost everything we need to do. And so if we worked really fast and put a lot of it up, then we'd have some chance of flattening the curve that's going to kill us otherwise. The only way to do that is to change the political equation that allows vested interest, in this case, the fossil fuel industry, to so powerfully dominate our political life that we can't do what we need to do at the pace we need to do it. That's why some of us started this divestment campaign a decade ago. And I got to say, it's gone great everywhere in the world except Harvard. We're at $15 trillion worth of endowments now. Institutions bigger than Harvard, the UC system with $100 billion in endowments and pensions have divested. Institutions more famous and prestigious than Harvard have divested. Oxford and Cambridge, both of them in the course of this year. People with more moral standing than the Harvard administration, for instance, the Pope, have this year come out strongly for divestment, on and on and on. And as Jeremy's pointed out, it would have made great financial sense. But, and here goes straight to these questions around democracy, and let's bring them home, okay? I don't mean to be the skunk at the garden party, but let's talk honestly. It became very clear over the last 10 years, thanks to the work of people like Ilana and her predecessors, that Harvard students were all out for divestment by majorities of 75 or 80%. It became completely clear that the Harvard faculty was all out for divestment by similar majorities, but Harvard did not move, and so alumni tried to do their thing. This Harvard Forward campaign put forward nominees last year. Though the administration made it ludicrously hard to vote for petition candidates, and though several weeks before the election, people from the Alumni Association and others wrote letters trying to paint them as special interests, the candidates for advocating for divestment won big victories in the overseers election among alumni last year. What did Harvard do? Did Harvard take that as an occasion to say, okay, you're right, the alumni are on the same page as the faculty and the students, let's just get this done once and for all? No, Harvard decided that it would change the rules of further elections so that there would be no chance that anything more than 6 petition candidates would ever be able to sit on the 30-member board of overseers. That's not the same as storming the Capitol, but it's not that far removed in its intent from the kind of voter suppression that we see marking elections of far more import around this country going forward. And what it says is the same thing, that power is unwilling to concede to the realities of the day in which we live, that it can't give up even a little bit of the kind of institutional privilege that it's accustomed to, and won't take seriously the demands for change coming from every quarter. That's unhealthy. That unhealthiness blown up to a larger scale is precisely what makes it impossible to proceed. Not ever, I mean, eventually we're going to get done what we need to do because it makes economic sense, but eventually doesn't cut it. Winning slowly is another way of losing on climate change. It's the first problem we've faced as a species that comes with an unavoidable time limit. If you don't get it right soon, then you never get it right. And that's why it's just so incredibly discouraging to watch institutions that should know better, and Harvard is the one that, that we're all connected with, be unwilling to take even the tiniest bit of initiative here and do what needs doing. And I gotta say truthfully, it made me a little reluctant to join in this conversation, because I don't want to be part of the just kind of, yeah, we're just going to keep talking about this forever sort of thing. That's not good enough. We actually have to do things once in a while. And this is the easy, obvious, powerful, and as Jeremy points out, lucrative thing for Harvard to be doing right the hell now.
Yeah, so Jeremy.
Yeah, just that was hugely accurate and comprehensive, but I have 3 quick points. One, Dr. Faust used to say, in lieu of divestment, there would be engagement. And I took a deep breath several years ago and waited for Harvard management, et cetera, to announce a engagement program that everyone could get behind. But regrettably, not a word of follow-up occurred over several years, which I consider, therefore, paints the original statement as cynical. Secondly, the moral case here is not, don't use fossil fuels. Of course, we still have to for some considerable time. The moral case rests on the destructive nature of the leadership of these great companies like Exxon. They have deliberately ignored their own science. They have deliberately funded obfuscation. I think Bill and the rest of us would agree that they have probably cost the US 10 years, if not more, of effective action. That 10 years may, I hope not, but may be absolutely critical on the downside. It is a very dangerous game to have played, and they are immoral to have done it. Just like the tobacco companies who might as well have gone out down the high street with a machine gun killing people and never had to pay for it. This may end up killing or damaging people on a far greater scale, and no doubt they will not pay for that either. But third point, and that is, this is bigger than your portfolio. Unfortunately, for the great universities, the great research universities receive scores of millions, and in certain cases, hundreds of millions of dollars to do perfectly good, desirable research. That is irresistible. And one of them said to two of us, quote, "We simply can't afford to step away," unquote. They receive so much money in research that regardless of what the investment people on the investment committee might say, it's too big an issue for them to alienate the fossil fuel industry. So be advised of that. Thank you.
And Jeremy, I am reminded when you talked about the engagement that was put forward by Drew Faust, that back in the days of the divestment movement from South African investments, that was the line that was fed to us. Oh, we've got to stay in this to stay engaged with the South Africans, to stay engaged in the system of apartheid, to stay engaged in the system of how Harvard was supporting companies that were literally wrecking people's lives. So your comment about the leadership also, I think you're generous. I think it goes back more than 20 years. That the disinformation that the fossil fuel industry paid for to perpetuate this in the society is well back into the early 2000s, and in fact, at some of the UN negotiations even before then.
1982 is.
Yeah, 1982 is probably.
Exxon scientists sort of connected these dots between greenhouse gas emissions and global warming in the late 70s.
Right.
In the late 70s, the first research, yes.
Yeah, we've had plenty of time, and I think, you know, something I've only learned about recently was the role that fossil fuel executives have played in the sort of radicalization of the GOP to become the party of climate denial. Like the Tea Party was funded by fossil fuel executives, by the Koch brothers and others. And it's not a grassroots movement. We've all been sort of like duped into that storyline. So I think when we think about, again, connecting to where we are in this moment as a nation, we think about voter suppression, when we think about gerrymandering, when we think about these ways in which our democracy functions or doesn't, this determines whether we have climate deniers in office or people who want to implement solutions. And to sort of paraphrase what Bill said was something I heard really powerfully just lately, was that climate delay is the same thing as climate denial at this point. The stakes are so high, so that to say like we'll go slowly is the same thing as saying like we're fine with everything melting and burning and all of it. And that's, I think, the big challenge. And from where I sit, what I see is that the climate crisis is a leadership crisis. It's very clear to me that we have not had the leaders that we have needed, not just in terms of individuals, but in terms of the quantity of leaders, right? This is a challenge that's going to take leaders from every community. And to be blunt, we've had a climate movement that until very recently was led by a very small group of white men opposing another small group of white men, fossil fuel executives. And that just like hasn't worked out yet, right? And so with the youth movement, with the diversification of the movement, with the intersectionality that we're now seeing, I mean, I'm sitting here wearing a sweatshirt that says climate feminist. I obviously believe we should have more women in positions of power within this movement, and that we're sort of in the midst of seeing what I call a feminist climate renaissance. Like, what would it look like if we approached this whole issue not from a place of like ego and winning and defeating and all the war metaphors for the climate crisis, and instead thought about this as like, how do we heal and nurture and build community and collaborate, right? This is not about like some magnificent hero who's going to save us. This is about helping everyone to find their role in solutions, because it's going to take, you know, farmers and artists and lawyers and scientists and investors and we can each bring whatever special skills we have, you know, whatever we studied at Harvard, whatever we've gone on to become, to contribute. And I think that's the moment where we have to realize, like, what is the Venn diagram between your skills and resources, the climate solutions that need doing, and honestly, like, what's going to get you out of bed in the morning? Because that's sort of what keeps me going. And on this question of like, is it too late? As a scientist, I look at all of these graphs of projections, whether that's like sea level rise or warming or the loss of ecosystems and species or ice melting and whatever, all these horrible trends. But we also know that in all these scientific projections, there is still a really wide range of possible futures, right? So I get out of bed every morning thinking like, how can I make sure we have the best one that is still possible? And within keeping climate change from going completely out of hand, there's also the ability to adapt to the changes that have already happened and will continue. So coming at it from this sort of like maybe boringly practical approach, I think has really helped me have some interesting conversations and build some really productive collaborations.
Yeah, so how can we capitalize on the morality that the youth movement is really displayed? Because this whole question of equity, one thing that I've noticed as a person, as a Black person over my lifetime, is that in the younger groups, the apprehension and the sort of structural racism that you find, you're talking about environmental organizations or whatever, isn't there. That people of all, plenty of young white kids stepped into the Black Lives Movement, all in. They didn't even have to stop to ask themselves about this. Of course, this is wrong. Of course, what's happening to the climate is wrong, and we're in a position to help make it right. How do we tap that moral energy? How do we tap that moral energy to move things forward in the broader society? And as I throw this out to the panel, I have to say that I'm getting a lot of questions about where Joe Biden might fit into our future, if people would like to reflect on that. Who's good to go? Ilana, Bill, who's next?
I'm happy to start off. I think there is this broader project for young people, and I'll get to Joe Biden in this, of building the political power necessary, right, to translate this kind of moral clarity and idealism into concrete policy. And that's sort of a two-part project. I think we've seen the first part of that really succeed, particularly with the election of Joe Biden. It's been reflected by his cabinet picks, with now where the Senate is at. And that first part was, making it unaffordable for politicians to not deal with the climate crisis in a serious and largely intersectional way. But the second part is more important, and that's ultimately getting the people into positions of power who need to be there. And we've seen some progress in this election with that. Like Sunrise has done an incredible job supporting folks who are now in office, but like we need the folks who Sunrise has been pushing for to get elected everywhere, and not just in our Congress, not just when it comes to the White House. We need a Chloe Maxman. I don't know if folks know who she is. She's from Maine. She was actually like a leader of the Divest Harvard movement. I'm sure someone will drop a link to Chloe Maxman in a second. We need like a Chloe Maxman everywhere. We need like a Sunrise movement champion everywhere, flipping every single district at every level, from the local to the national. So it's incredibly exciting to have, a president who has, the boldest presidential climate plan yet, who really does seem to be focusing environmental justice in that plan. I also think Kamala Harris's record, at least in the Senate, speaks really, really well to a focus on climate equity and a willingness to work with grassroots climate justice groups. But, this is where like the opportunity for activists and for people pushing for change has never been greater. Like, unless we maintain the momentum necessary to push for systemic change, it's not going to happen. I think like we learned that with the Obama years, and Bill can probably speak to that in part. I know it was energizing for a lot of folks who were in the divestment movement earlier. But like, this is the time to be more active than ever, as Ayana said, no matter what your skill set is in the climate movement, because we have the political potential to really, really build the foundation of a lasting change here, to really tackle the climate crisis in an intersectional and imminent way. But it's always the question of political will. So like, people have to keep making it completely unaffordable for the Biden administration to do anything but go ahead 1,000 miles an hour on climate justice. Otherwise, you know, the imperative for action is gone.
Yeah,
Bill?
Ilana's just right. I'm confident that the Biden administration is going to try and do what they can, in part because former Harvardian Gina McCarthy is going to be our domestic climate czar. I watched her tell the Harvard president exactly how quickly he should divest when we were in a meeting a couple of years ago. I have no doubt that she is capable of saying in a broad Boston accent with the salty language required precisely where people need to get off and what they need to do. And she's going to be great. But that, do not for a minute, anybody, think that DC is the sum total of where we're going to get this work done, because it's not. Even at its best, Washington moves slowly, you know, and remember that this is a global problem that we cannot solve in any one capital. That's why the overwhelming job around the world, and I organize all over the world precisely because of this, is to change the zeitgeist more than anything else, to change people's sense of what's normal and natural and obvious, where we're going and how fast we need to get there. That's why we tune in hard to other power centers like Wall Street. And in the last couple of years, we've seen enormous progress with pushing institutions like BlackRock or like Chase Bank, beginning to force them to take different kinds of actions. And those are precisely the places where Harvard could play a decisive role. Let's be serious here. We all know what Harvard's, you know, profile is, who comes out of here, where they go to work, I mean, you know, this is the reason that Harvard is the richest university on earth. The reason that it has the power and the privilege it does is precisely the reason why we need it to go to work on these things. And I think it's possible that we're at a moment when even institutions as hidebound and encrusted as Harvard are starting to realize this. I was really proud of Harvard yesterday because the Institute of Politics immediately said that Elise Stefanik, the congresswoman from my old district in upstate New York, who'd been part of the election fraud lies, that she was no longer welcome on their board at the Institute of Politics, that democracy was too important, that we weren't going to be teaching kids about this. If Harvard would apply that same lens to its own actions, to things like elections for the Board of Overseers at Harvard, then we would see a transformed place, able to go do good things in the world, instead of a kind of slightly sad institution hanging on to old-fashioned kinds of power and privilege, and with by its fingernails, and trying not to give any of it up. That's not how it works. The future is where Ilana is. The future is where the young people coming out of this place who are changing the world are going. And it's too late for Harvard to be a leader in any of this at this point, but it's not too late for it to be a helper, for it to be a part of the fight, for it to stand up and do the right thing, instead of what it's done for the last decade on climate change, which is very much the wrong thing, which is constantly send a signal that we don't need real change.
Bill, before you move on from this, though, what about the role of the Harvard Corporation? You keep talking about the overseers and the elections there, but as we know, the power is held at the corporation.
Yeah, well, I mean, the closest anybody can get to the corporation is the overseers, which frankly, just in terms of a branding exercise, might be time to pick a new name. If you wanted to get right down to it, overseer doesn't sound so good, but at any rate, that's the closest we're ever allowed to get at Harvard to having any kind of democratic input into things. Truthfully, Harvard's having worked on them both, it's harder to exercise democratic governance at Harvard than it is at Exxon or Chevron. At least there you can buy some shares and go to the shareholder meeting and cause a ruckus. As Jeremy points out, it doesn't get you very far, but at least you're able to make some noise. Under the new rules that Harvard's put forward, they don't even want anybody making noise, you know? So much credit to Ilana and people for being willing to do this. I think what a lot of us are trying to say is simply that to the extent, I mean, everybody has to figure out where they have power. All of us have a tiny bit of power in our homes, right? So it's a good idea to put in the new light bulb or to change the way you eat or what car you're driving. But at this point, nobody thinks that that kind of power is enough to make a difference that matters numerically in the time that we have left. If we had 75 years, sure, but we don't. So you have to look for the sources of power that are close to hand. Some of those are electoral, some of those and some of those are financial. Harvard's overwhelming power is this power of financial power and the power of reputation that comes with it. And leveraging that reputation should not be too much to ask. Harvard should be out there, you know, I mean, and if it did, think how students and new alumni and things would be cheering it on. Think how it would change people's perception of this place. That would be a truly great moment. And, you know, possible a lot more of us might be really more engaged alumni than we are if Harvard was a little bit different place. I know I'm looking forward to voting for the 3 candidates that Harvard Forward is putting up for this year's overseer ballot. I got to talk with all 3 of them. Megan Redshirt Shaw, and Natalie Unterstel, and Dr. F. Fabara. The 3 of them are spectacular candidates that would be a great help to Harvard. And I hope that people take seriously the opportunity to get behind them when the next ballot for the overseers arrives.
I just want to add one thing on to that, because I still think it is a really good point to bring up. And as Bill really made clear, this is again why the democratization of the university is so fundamentally tied to the issue of divestment, and really the broader issue of having an endowment that is reflective of the desires and needs of Harvard's own constituents, right? Which are like livable futures for the students who are attending, livable futures for the children of their alumni and so forth. But ultimately, like, I mean, everyone should be voting for these overseers. But in addition to that, we need to be holding the Harvard Corporation accountable every single day for its continued refusal to divest from the industry that is destroying this planet. I mean, because without that, nothing is going to change. Like, the Harvard Corporation is one of the best examples of how much power can be concentrated within the hands of just like a finite group of people who are not regularly engaging with the constituents that they're meant to, at the end of the day, be serving. That is really the purpose of the Harvard Corporation, right? Is to ensure the future of the university such that it can be serving its students, faculty, and alumni. And that's not happening right now. Divestment is just the clearest case study of that. But so, like, if you are interested in pushing for change, know who the Harvard Corporation members are. And this is something that we are trying to help with as a campaign. Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard is educating the Harvard community about this. But you should know who every single individual who is stopping this institution from being a leader on climate is, and you should be calling them, you should be emailing them, you should be making your voice heard to them in every single way. Because they should know that they can't just evade accountability, right? The idea of just having a corporation at like the head of this institution in and of itself sort of creates this distance between us and the center of power. But ultimately, it's just a group of people. It's a group of people who've been getting away with not divesting and many other things for a long time because the Harvard community largely doesn't know who they are, doesn't know what they're doing, doesn't know what they're up to, and they want it to stay that way. So that's what has to change.
So we've been talking a fair amount about Harvard, I think, in a really important way here. But I want to take this a bit wider now for a moment with you, Jeremy. There's some questions from people in the audience saying, okay, what are the most promising initiatives that people can do, frankly, with the investing that they're doing. Yes, okay, take fossil fuels out of their personal portfolios, but what are the opportunities there? And how can people make a difference? Because as Bill points out, new light bulbs and electric cars aren't going to solve this, but perhaps impact investing, the kind of thing that you're doing, could really help make a difference. What advice do you have for people who are participating in this session now along these lines?
I think impact investing is spectacularly exciting, among other things. The quantity and quality of the new research that is buzzing around in green technology, loosely speaking, and regenerative farming is truly impressive. And there's no better place to do it than in Boston. And you have to understand that this is the biggest change in global economy since the introduction of coal and oil. It is going to take tens of trillions of dollars to move us to a truly sustainable, renewable base. And if we don't do it, it will be catastrophic. And what we have to do is we have to have a lot of us basically decide that we are approximately all in. Everything that we can do, we have to do. Because unless a lot more people throw themselves into the battle, and they do it soon, we will probably fail, certainly in my opinion. And just a more snippy point, we all came late to this, with the possible exception of Bill, Jim Hansen, and a couple of handfuls. And I wouldn't want an urban myth to develop here, because the most disappointing thing I faced over the last 15 years, my stump speech at universities and business schools mainly, was a heartbreaking lack of interest by the youth. Everyone would use this cliche about the passion of youth, and I would say, where the hell is it? It's totally lacking. And happily, that all changed, but it only changed a couple of years ago. And it changed abruptly, and we owe one enormous debt to Greta Thunberg and her folk, and then the more revolutionary types that sprung from that out of London. But that was disappointingly late in the game. And we better become passionate on a broader front and keep growing that group, because it's been carried by handfuls of people, and now in the last couple of years by many handfuls of people. But it has to become a much broader, passionate and more passionate movement yet.
Let me just say, I just want to quickly just say, Greta is one of my favorite people on earth. I love working with her. She's fantastic. And the really important news is that there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs scattered around the planet. They are in every continent and in every city. And now they have 10 million people behind them. The numbers of people who've turned out and they draw on a well of real history. I was so glad that Ilana brought up Chloe Maxman. She didn't quite finish the story though. Chloe, left after leading Harvard Divest campaign, went back to her native state of Maine, won election as a state representative, and in this last election cycle, won election as a state senator, beating the sitting minority leader of the Maine Senate. She's the kind, and she's precisely the kind of person. I mean, the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal, almost to a person, came out of the campus divestment fights. People like Varshini Prakash, who divested UMass Amherst 6 or 7 years ago, on and on and on. So there is a huge base, happily, and it is really good to see. And I think I will just add that my next kind of project, in a lot of ways, is to make sure that that the youth climate and social justice base is met by a collection of older people around this country who get similarly fired up and engaged. We need a lot more Jeremy Granthams, people of, I think we're going to call them experienced Americans, who are ready to be just as fiery And I think that they are out there because I think people are coming to terms with the fact that we're about to be the first generations that leave the world a worse place than we found it. And that's a terrible legacy. So, keep your eyes on that kind of organizing as it emerges too. It's going to take all of us, and it's going to take all of us in the broadest sense. Don't forget for a minute that the iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. That's true in this country, and it's especially true around this world. So what we really need more than anything else, more than money, what we really need is a new conception of human solidarity, a conception that allows us to feel solidarity with the more than human world too, and that lets us go forward and in the same kind of strange way that I think some people are starting to feel that maybe what happened last week in Washington, D.C. was a kind of wake-up call that may eventually pay useful dividends in helping us see more clearly what kind of country we live in. So in a certain sense, climate change, with all the traumas that come with it, may help us see more clearly the unfairness of the world that we inhabit in time to allow us to do something about it. That's got to be our hope.
Yeah, Bill, and let me ask this, throw out this question about inclusivity here,
Yeah.
because I noticed in the international climate negotiations way back when things were getting going, that countries like China and India were kind of kicked to the curb. They were not considered, there was the Annex I countries, they were the rich white countries, although it included Japan. And the rest of the world was non-annex and involved in the Kyoto process. And the dialogue did not happen with China, with India, with Brazil, with South Africa, with the emerging parts of the planet. Instead, they were villainized by our politics. Oh, China, we can't give them some sort of advantage. And yet, our historical emissions in this rich part of the world way overshadowed theirs. How do we really bring inclusivity to this, since this is a worldwide challenge, and yet internationally, we have still clung to the old sort of economic imperialism, colonialism. The rich part of the world knows best. How do we bring inclusivity into this?
To connect the dots between your question and what Bill was just saying, I think the fact that we now have a 3-generation climate movement is really remarkable. The last time I saw Bill in person was backstage, I think in September 2019 at the Global Youth Climate Strike, right? And we were watching Greta speak on stage, and he and I were back there, and I was like, oh, we've got like teenagers through elders now doing this work. And there's so much that we can learn from each other. So that to the extent that we can strengthen those intergenerational connections, of course, in the US, but also globally, that's key. And when we think about the role that Greta has played in inspiring youth around the world, I think it's also important to note the counterfactual that she could still be sitting alone outside of the parliament in Sweden right now, if it weren't for mostly girls, teenage girls all over the world saying, actually, that's a really good idea, I'm in, right? To start a trend requires that people follow. And I think we need to laud followers and co-creators in that same vein. And we think about who's leading the youth movement. It is mostly women, it is girls. And so my work right now has been focused around how do we support women climate leaders? How do we nurture this feminist climate renaissance? Steve, as you know, last time we spoke was about my anthology, All We Can Save, which is this collection of wisdom from over 40 women writing about their expertise around climate truth, courage, and solutions for the climate crisis. And the next phase of that work is actually building financial support for women climate leaders and thinking about what it means to build community and use that for, as an educational tool. How are we changing the way we educate people, and how climate actually is part of all of the different academic disciplines. And especially when it comes to, when you mention inclusivity, people of color, women of color in particular, we know that people of color actually care more about climate than their white counterparts. It is, around 49% of white people in the US compared to, 57% of Black people, almost 70% of Latinx people who are like, this is a crisis and we need to do something about it. So when we aren't inclusive, we're actually hindering our ability to be successful, because why wouldn't you want to include the people who already care, who can be leading their communities forward? And so in the heat of the movement for Black Lives this summer, I was writing about this. I was, publishing an op-ed in the Post about how, as essentially like an open letter to white environmentalists, being like, if we want to win at addressing the climate crisis, we need to take this burden of racism off of the shoulders of people of color, because we care, but we can't help at our full capacity if we're dealing with all this other stuff. And the same thing goes for our crisis of democracy. And the same thing goes for the economic recession that we're in. We can't expect people to be able to fully contribute to solutions if we're burdened by these other things. And it's a very unfortunate truth, because of course we want to just deal with the climate crisis. It's big and hard enough as it is, but we need to solve problems at the level of complexity with which they exist.
Yes, I think that is a fitting summary. Just incidentally, by the way, when this Senate flipped, with the two folks getting elected from Georgia, research shows that people who had never voted before, even some people who'd never voted in a presidential election before, came out. They were committed environmentalists and young folks. And the folks most likely to identify with the climate were the Black and brown voters in that constituency.
Yeah.
So
not just bearing the brunt of the problem, but also we're ready to be part of this.
Working for the solution. And by the way, Jeremy Grantham's work helps support getting to those people who previously weren't voters. So this is indeed the future. Harvard admissions now are what, over 50% people of color, I believe, on a recent round. It's about that, trying to reflect the overall society, where we will be in the year 2042 when the nation is predominantly people of, ever so slightly people of color, the way California is today. On a personal level, I'm looking forward to having the box be non-colored, that's the one that gets ticked in the demographic discussion. Jeremy, we got a couple of seconds. You want to wrap it up for us before we leave?
What I wanted to say is that I'm not an American. This is not an American issue. CO2 is completely democratic. It is totally fungible. And the Grantham Foundation goes out of its way to invest its grant making anywhere in the world where the leverage is the greatest. And it usually is not the US, where climate workers, lawyers, et cetera, are twice as expensive as Europe and 5 times as expensive as we can get lawyers on the ground in India, for example. And China, just a word on China. China has not been sidelined. China is, as we speak, bullying its way onto the climate stage, and it dominates the new industries. They have 400,000 electric buses, we have 400. It has more electric cars, more fast trains, more high-tech transmission than the rest of the world added together, and is building them at that rate, faster than all of us together. And we will regret ceding the field to them as they dominate one area after another.
Indeed, it's interesting. How many people have died from the virus in China? Maybe they talk about 5,000.
How many have died in the last month? Nil.
Nil. And who's going to be around to, what economies are going to move forward coming out of this recession that we're seeing in this land of 300, almost 400,000 people dying from the virus alone? Just looking at that factor. So,
and people, by the way, dismiss China's performance as depending on autocracy. Taiwan, equally Chinese ethnically, is in first place. It has had 1/10 per capita of the death rate of China, which has had 1/100th of the US, i.e., you can work it out, 1,000th of the death rate of the US, Taiwan has had, with over 20 million people they have had eight people die.
And to connect those dots between public health and climate and all of this, I mean, we mentioned Gina McCarthy earlier. She was, about a year ago, she was the director of the Harvard Center for Climate Health and the Global Environment. She had been obviously the head of the EPA under Obama, now going to be leading domestic climate policy in the White House. And although this is a global issue, the lack of leadership from the US has been a remarkable hindrance to getting global coordination. And so, you know, I think there's a huge opportunity here to think about what would it mean if we showed up as a leader, as the greatest overall emitter of greenhouse gases, the largest contributor to the problem, as the source of delay, which is essentially equivalent to denial. What does that mean? What does that look like? What opportunities does that open? And for those who are interested in learning more about Gina, we have on my podcast that you mentioned, How to Save a Planet, we're interviewing her in the episode that comes out tomorrow. And I think we know that people care about their health. And her argument is that, you know, this is a matter of public service for public health. This is a way to draw more people into the climate movement by connecting this with their well-being directly, not at some distant point in the future. And so it'll be really interesting to have someone with her expertise leading the coordination on domestic climate from the White House and coordinating with John Kerry on the international side and seeing sort of how we as outsiders and the youth climate movement and the 3 generations deep that are represented on this panel can really push to make sure that they're living up to their campaign promises, per the question about Biden, who's promised 40% of climate resources to go to historically disadvantaged communities who are dealing with the brunt of the impacts, you know, who's promised that we'll get to 100% clean energy by 2035. Like, this is going to take a lot of pressure to hold them to these promises. And so I just wanted to end by saying there really is still a role for all of us in making sure that we enact the solutions that we already have at our fingertips.
And Steve, Dr. Johnson did such a great job of connecting us right the way back to where Dr. Bernstein began us with those questions around health and how they connect. And really, it would be so wonderful to see Harvard taking its role in this leadership fight. Harvard, as a faculty and students and alumni who are absolutely
make us proud.
Skills, talents, curiosity, insights, connections to make an enormous difference. That's why it's so frustrating that Harvard as an institution has been so backward on this, because it's held back our ability to make that kind of change. So if everybody listening to this would just follow Ilana down this correct path and get Harvard as an institution on the right side of history, it'll make everybody's work that much more powerful.
Yes.
Yeah, closing shout out, if I can have a second, divestharvard.com, lots of information on our campaign. If you care about not just fossil fuel divestment, but fundamentally the democratization of this institution into making Harvard a vehicle for a just and stable future, join us, because we need you.
For now and for what's coming. So it's my role now. We have to say goodbye. Turns out that technology is not being nice to Philip Lovejoy from Harvard Alumni Association. So I'm going to say the goodbye for this. And just with this closing remark, this is the moment in time. This is when whatever we're doing right now to deal with the climate emergency obviously is not enough. We need to do more. And if I were speaking from my African roots, I would say that it is our job as ancestors for those who are coming after us to be sure that we take advantage of this moment, however we can, in the best way that we can. But just like neutrality in the face of racism perpetuates it, neutrality in the face of this climate emergency is also perpetuating it. So each one of us today knows the special things, the special abilities that we have to make a difference here. And the question for all of us is, are we going to take advantage of those skills, insights, beliefs to act? And action now depends on us, you and me, getting it together to do it. So thanks from the Harvard Alumni Association. Thanks from the university. Thanks to all of you. Ilana Cohen, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, Jeremy Grantham, Bill McKibben, thanks so much. And Ari Bernstein, who is not on the screen now, but was before. Thank you all for contributing to this amazing discussion. And for those who aren't screened here, Valerie Nelson and Terrence McNally for really spark plugging this and getting this to come together. Thanks to all of you.